the average losses, when you aggregate all of the disasters, all of the infrastructure that we could lose to disasters, it adds up to something like $31.6 billion. In Brazil, that number is $13.6 billion. And the difference is because we have more infrastructure, so we have more to lose. Brazil has, by comparison, lesser infrastructure. It is also that our risk profile may be higher compared to Brazil. So this methodology we've applied to all these countries to then be able to have a playing field to understand how countries compare with each other.
Hello and a warm welcome to a very special podcast, Unusual Suspects. I'm your host, Gaurav Chaudhary. This is a series about unraveling stories of entrepreneurs, investors, professionals who are disruptors yet not in your face. Their disruptions have consistently delivered on the purpose and the mission they've embarked on. Their values are as strong as the mission. While they're ruthless in pursuing their ambition, they don't stray from being leaders who are not just admired for the vision and relentless pursuit, but also for how they are building an ecosystem of believers who consistently push the boundaries. In each episode, I speak to one such leader, talking to her or him or them about their businesses, lives, inspirations, interests, challenges, pivot moments and turning points, successes, failures, agonies, and excess, and of course, the little joys of life and work. Unusual Suspect streams on Earshot.in, Spotify.com, Apple Podcasts, YT Music, MoneyControl.com, and a host of other podcast streaming platforms and directly. For this episode, I'm delighted to have Amit Prothi, the Director General of Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had launched the CDRI at the United Nations Climate Action Summit in September 2019. CDRI is a global partnership of national governments, UN agencies and programs, multilateral development banks, the private sector, and the academia. Mr. Prothi is an international expert with nearly 25 years of progressive leadership in the fields of urban planning and resilient infrastructure, with experience across more than 15 countries in North America, Asia, and Europe. Welcome to Unusual Suspects, Amit. Delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Gaurav, for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Amit, just to set things in context for my benefit and the benefit of listeners, why do you think the Modi government felt the need to incubate a global organization like CDRI? And just to add to that, how has been the international response so far since its inception in September 2019? That's just about 5 years ago.
Sure. So Gaurav, I think one has to put the context of the organization in a larger perspective of the government. If you look at how the Modi government has been thinking about infrastructure, we've been focused on really pushing forth a large, ambitious agenda to build infrastructure in the country. In parallel, this is also a government and leadership that has been had first-hand experience with disasters. The Prime Minister himself was the Chief Minister in the post-Gujarat earthquake situation in 2011, where he was involved in reconstructing Gujarat after a massive earthquake. So this is a government that has understood the value of paying attention to disaster risk reduction. And India is actually a global leader in this. We've set up the National Disaster Management Authority for domestic focus on this agenda. We've got the National Disaster Risk Reduction Force that goes in a post-disaster situation. So if you look at the focus on infrastructure and you look at the focus on disaster, the agenda for taking up global leadership in this space kind of was the obvious sort of next step. And so the history of this is that in 2016, India had hosted the Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. The PM saw an opportunity that, there could be a legacy of the conference by essentially announcing a global organization that will respond to a global challenge that we're starting to see with increasing disasters, increasing climate change issues, and the intersection with infrastructure. And because India already had a fair amount of experience, it became something that was announced that India would show leadership in. So the Prime Minister announced CDRI in 2019 in the Climate Summit in New York. And we've got 40 members or 40 countries that are members of this organization, as well as 7 international organizations. And we're growing. Every year we are adding about 7, 8, 9 countries who are joining this coalition, saying this is an important agenda and we want to be part of it. So we're really becoming more and more international as we speak.
Amit, just to add to that, and taking on from what you said, what is the mandate of CDRI, which you briefly alluded to? Is there a distinction in the mandate for member countries and organizations belonging to the global north and the global south? Is there something that countries from different blocks are expected to deliver?
Yeah. So Gaurav, the mandate really is threefold. One is we need to highlight the importance of the agenda for the entire world. And in a way, when we talk about disaster resilient infrastructure, it's about vulnerability of infrastructure, which translates to vulnerability of people to disasters such related to earthquakes, cyclones, floods, landslides, etc. If you open the newspaper today or yesterday, what are you seeing? You're seeing that we're facing cyclones in emerging markets. Cuba has just had a cyclone go through where power infrastructure has been impacted. But you've also seen a flood in Spain. You've also seen images of disasters that are not unique to certain parts of the world. They're actually, starting to become quite evident in both global north, global south countries. And as a coalition, we don't make a distinction. Every member is considered equal. What we're trying to do is, one, advocating for the importance of the agenda. Two, recognizing that there is a huge opportunity to really learn from each other. We may have experiences related to extreme heat that other countries may benefit from. Other countries have experiences dealing with tsunamis or earthquakes that other countries may be benefiting from. So the whole point of the coalition is how do we actually bring together experiences, knowledge, etc., to share, to build our collective understanding of how do you address these growing risks. And then we're also focused on actually on the ground trying to do pilot projects that can again shift the needle towards more disaster resilient infrastructure. So each member is equal. We don't make a distinction between global north and global south. We're really looking at it from a point of view of vulnerability. And we are providing leadership through advocacy, capacity building and knowledge, as well as technical assistance on the ground.
Amit, CDRI has also emerged as an aggregator for a global database of risks. And there's also the question of island nations, and that's a special problem that there's always this view among and from island nations that they face the gravest risk of climate change. However, they have the least influence in shaping climate action globally. How can island nations be better prepared through early warnings and predictions owing to infrastructure resilient island states or IRIS program? If you can just elaborate on that bit, Amit.
Sure, Gaurav. So, first of all, because we are a coalition of countries that bring very, very different contexts, we wanted to come up with a way of understanding vulnerability across our wider set of countries, but then also apply that globally. So what we did 2 years ago is we started to build a whole global database of risk. Last year, we launched a report and this database that basically points to the amount of risk we are facing across 8 infrastructure sectors from 6 kinds of hazards. This is in the public domain. Such kind of data does not exist, which is looking just on the risk to infrastructure sectors. Now, one thing we found was that small island developing states, these are your small nations like, you look at Maldives, you look at Fiji, you look at Jamaica, etc. These are small nations. They have very unique geographies. They also have very unique economies, and they also have very unique vulnerabilities. And what we are finding is that small island development states are actually disproportionately the risk is higher in these small geographies, and we wanted to do something about it. When we talk about climate change, these are the nations that are going to be hit first, or are already hit by climate change, at a scale that's much more disproportionate to other countries who may have larger economies to be able to bounce back from a disaster, etc. So we launched a program. CDRI launched a program called the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, or IRIS, with the intention that we will provide technical assistance to small island developing states. So the idea is that we will bring global knowledge. We will bring knowledge that may already exist in these nations across each other. We will become the aggregators of knowledge practices that can make these communities more resilient. And in that context, we're looking at early warning. For example, in the Dominican Republic, we're working with the government to look at something called a multi-hazard app. So there's an application that's being put together which will look at giving warnings to people if there is a cyclone, but also if there is a tsunami or a wildfire, etc. So this is called multi-hazard early warning. The idea is that and we've done this very well in India, the state of Odisha, if you remember. If you think about the amounts of lives we've been able to save in Odisha because we are warning people ahead of time to be prepared for a cyclone. That's the idea of doing early warning in small island developing states. Some of them have already been doing this work, so we are also bringing learnings from one island nation to another. The notion is that by being an aggregator of knowledge, best practices, we can start to address high vulnerabilities in these nations that are uniquely, disproportionately more vulnerable to climate change than other nations.
Amit, there is also the whole idea and the concept of average annual loss in infrastructure. And my question here is very basic and fundamental, is that how do you arrive at a calculation for 117 countries? Because different countries have different challenges, different conditions, and different climatic conditions and situations. How are the corresponding figures different for countries such as India and Brazil?
Thanks, Gaurav. So maybe we just finish the thought on IRIS, because I just through the IRIS program we're actually helping or working with 13 countries already, and in fact in the next couple of weeks we will be announcing a new set of awards where the expectation is that we'll be supporting another 10 to 12 countries, again to look at resilience of infrastructure unique to island nations. So stay tuned for that. Now, coming back to your question on average annual loss. So when we think about infrastructure, um, you know think about your roads, your bridges, your dikes, your rail systems, your telecommunication towers, your power towers, etc. So this is all physical assets. And when you have an event such as an earthquake or a cyclone or a tsunami, this asset gets impacted. And when the asset gets impacted, your communities around it that are depending on those assets suffer. So, we took that basic premise of saying, how do we, for these 117 countries, but even beyond, how do we, so there's a methodology that is well understood in the insurance sector. So, when the insurance sector puts out a premium, they're doing a certain analysis that is looking at your hazard. So understanding of, what is the likelihood of a cyclone in a certain area? What is the likelihood of a landslide in a certain area? What is the likelihood of an earthquake in a certain area? So that's looking at the hazard. Then you look at what is the level of exposure. So which of your assets, your towers, etc., which of those could be subject to that hazard? So you're building a tower in a zone 3 for an earthquake. Well, that tower would be vulnerable. That tower would be exposed to that hazard. So we look at the hazard risk, we look at the exposed assets, so the infrastructure assets that are exposed to that hazard, and then we look at something called vulnerability to understand not every tower is serving the same area. Which areas have a greater need for that service compared to others? So there's a whole metrics around vulnerability that we have built. So that methodology we put together, we used global databases. There's a lot of data out there. So we pulled together global databases to say, exposure, hazard, vulnerability, we correlated that data, and then we came out with this metrics called average annual loss. What that metrics tells a country is that in a given year, you're at risk of losing certain amount of asset value. So if there's an earthquake, your asset value that you lose could be this much. If there's a cyclone, it could be this much. So we've aggregated that at a national level. This is an average. So if the average is based on a 10-year period to say in a given 10-year period, this is the probabilistic losses. And this is all modeling, right? So we're saying this is the amount of loss that you could suffer. And how does that come down on an average annual loss? On an annual basis, how much can you lose? Now, when you look at India, we're looking at an average annual loss in the range of $31.6 billion. That means in a given year, the average losses when you aggregate all of the disaster, all of the infrastructure that we could lose to disasters, it adds up to something like $31.6 billion. In Brazil, that number is $13.6 billion. And the difference is because we have more infrastructure, so we have more to lose. Brazil has, by comparison, lesser infrastructure. It is also that our risk profile may be higher compared to Brazil. So this methodology we've applied to all these countries to then be able to have a playing field to understand how countries compare with each other.
Absolutely. Something very specific to India, and India's eastern coastline has been pounded by climate events, including very serious cyclonic storms and cyclones that have caused devastation in many instances. And the threat is almost there twice a year. How does the physical infrastructure behave in terms of such natural hazards and disasters? What kind of capacity building can an organization, an institution like CDRI help to provide? Can we create some kind of an open source model that can be replicated by other countries?
Sure, Gaurav. So, the open source model is something that we already created. It's called GIRI, GIRI. It is the risk database that I was mentioning in my previous response also. So at a country level right now, any country or most countries can go online and look at the risk profile for the infrastructure sectors. That information we've created and it's in the public domain, it's been peer reviewed, etc. In fact, we're building the next version of this model where we're actually going down to country special, like into sub state level, etc. So it gets a little bit more fine tuned. And the reason for going fine tuned is that when we're actually designing infrastructure, locating infrastructure, we need to understand these risks from a much more fine tuned perspective, much more granular perspective. I'll give you an example of the work we've done in the state of Odisha. Now, Odisha, as you know, is prone to cyclones. You mentioned that. Now, Odisha, if you think about, we've had a series of cyclones, and one thing we've become excellent at is we are actually able to save lives. So, if you look at historically, we would lose a lot more people to cyclones, lives of a lot more people to cyclones. And now we, lose any life lost is not something we should aim for, but we've reduced the number of losses considerably. It's not the same story for infrastructure. Infrastructure, we can continue to lose to risks from cyclones along our coastlines. So in Odisha, what we've done is we worked with the government of Odisha, we worked with some partners there, and we have understood all of the infrastructure assets related to your power transmission and distribution system. We've mapped it. We've come up with a set of indicators to understand how vulnerable are these assets to cyclone winds that are changing. One thing about climate change is that some of our risk patterns are changing. And in Odisha, the cyclonic pattern, has been changing. So we've come up with a model to understand how will that cyclone risk change in the future, which means what would be the wind speeds for which your infrastructure needs to be designed towards. And then from that, we've come up with a way of saying, okay, if you've got infrastructure that is so many years old, or if you've got towers that are placed at a certain distance where excessive wind could actually just bring down the wires, or if you've got infrastructure that is actually located within a floodplain. We've looked at all of that, and we've been able to give the government a set of roadmaps saying, here are the potential areas that you need to focus on. And we've also come up with some kind of a budget, numbers to be able to say that if you do A, B, or C, what are the budget implications for you? And we've been able to give that to the state government. The state government is looking at that quite closely. And for CDRI, what we're doing is we're translating this into a global framework that can then be applicable to other coastal areas. So, again, such information is not easily accessible. So for us, from this Odisha study, we've put a framework together that we will bring to other coastal areas to say, here is a methodology. Look at the age of your infrastructure. Look at the wind speeds that are changing. Look at the span of your transmission lines. Look at the, your equipment that may be in floodplain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're putting that framework together to be able to bring it to other countries.
Amit, this also is a very, very interesting concept of resilient dividends. And CDRI has been at the forefront of advocating this. My question is more from a conceptual point of view. How do you calculate resilient dividends vis-a-vis capital expenditure in physical infrastructure? Say, for instance, if we are commissioning highways or an expressway project on the coastline, invariably the discussion always ends and is dominated by the cost involved, which is the capital cost. Of course, there are operational costs that come in later. But how will you fit in the concept of resilient dividend within these parameters, Amit?
So, Gaurav, that is the million-dollar question, actually. When you are looking at your investment strategy for a piece of infrastructure, let's say it's a road on a coastal area, in a coastline, when you're doing your cash flow analysis, when you're doing your feasibility analysis, what you're saying is, I'm borrowing with an expectation that my infrastructure asset will provide services to X number of people over next X number of years. What we are saying is that if in your calculations, you're also able to understand that that service that you're expecting from certain number of people over a certain number of time is getting disrupted because of cyclonic activity, or because that roadway gets flooded from time to time, or there may be a landslide that interrupts it. If you can understand what is the potential losses you could suffer in your disruption to services, that amount will be much greater if you if will be much reduced if you invest in some upgrades ahead of time. So effectively, the notion is that if you invest 1 extra rupee, we are seeing that your services can continue 3-4 times. So essentially, the 1 rupee can give you a return of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rupees in the lifetime of that infrastructure. What we're saying is if you invest ahead of time, you have avoided losses. And if you can capture that avoided losses up in your initial calculations, that's a potential dividend of investing in resilience. So that's the notion of resilience dividend. And you see that if you see what happened during COVID, all of your infrastructure systems, you didn't have services, your metro stopped working, your toll roads were barely collecting money. Over and over, we are seeing that disasters are disrupting services, are disrupting infrastructure to the point where the expected returns are getting reduced. So if you can actually, in your upfront calculation, understand what is the potential of disasters affecting your bottom line, it may be a 10% chance that you may lose certain amount of money. And then you say, okay, if I can invest a little bit more, make my system a little bit more resilient today and avoid those losses, there is actually an economic benefit to that. And that's what we call resilience dividend.
Amit, how do you describe the specific roles of governments? And there's also the role of the global infrastructure community. Then, from a financing point of view, because these are very long gestation projects, the multilateral development banks have a big role to play. And of course, the private sector. And all of them have to come together. All these will have to come together and agree on roadmap on a kind of a broad consensus view, if all ideas were to put in action and this action actually led to deliverable, monitorable results, because it involves mobilizing public and private investment and also making it, giving the right incentives for the private sector also to invest in long gestation projects, particularly in disaster resilient infrastructure. So how do you see this coming about and falling in place, Amit?
Sure, Gaurav. So if you step back for a second and you think about governments are agreeing to meeting the sustainable development goals. Governments have also agreed that we will meet the targets set as part of the Sendai framework. Sendai framework target D very clearly says we will invest in resilient infrastructure. Similarly, governments are saying that we are going to, infrastructure is the backbone to achieve your SDGs. So in a way, governments are already committed to this agenda. And what we're trying to do is that, by highlighting, so what governments can do first is recognize the need to address disaster risk. And for that, having databases, data that can aggregate the importance of the agenda, the data that can share, where is the risk concentrated in your country, data that is reliable that others can pick it up and say, okay, I can run with this because this is coming from a reliable source. So data on risk that is reliably available, governments can look, be the providers of that. Governments also need to certain policies in place. So, it's one thing to say, I need my infrastructure providers to recognize risk. It's also another thing to say that I also need my infrastructure providers to address those risks. The policy framework can be set by governments. Governments can also provide financial incentives. This whole notion of resilience dividend, it will take some time to come in play. And so governments can be the early movers to say, I will support the offering of loans, for example, that are at discounted rates if the infrastructure provider is addressing risk upfront. So there are, the whole financial incentive structures can also be a place where governments can step in and say, that relates to setting standards, codes, etc. For the MDBs, I think MDBs can use their funds to really move the market. And one example is, China has a national policy on making sponge cities. So they're focusing a lot on nature-based solutions to address disaster flooding risk. MDBs are some of the first ones to say, okay, use our loans to experiment and come up with the new solutions. And once those are established, the market can pick it up. So, for MDBs, making their loans contingent on innovation, contingent on addressing risk, is something that they can try to do. I think for the private sector, it's all about innovation. Private sector, you see what's happening today with your green industries, your solar industry, your wind industry. The private sector has been experimenting, putting together, new technologies, putting together new ways of financing. This space of disaster resilience infrastructure, which is also quite closely related to climate adaptation, is an opportunity area, frankly. And if you're an early mover in that space, if you're able to say, you know what, my road that I'm building, that'll be a toll road, will also guarantee you service for 99% of the time. Others will not, and I will actually innovate to make that happen. You can become an early movers because people are starting to ask for where is the opportunity for these, funding for adaptation projects, or how do we address these risks through infrastructure? So for me, the private sector's role, frankly, is to innovate and then making sure that the expertise that they're providing is, paying more attention to issues of climate. Repeat this, I think, because I had a phone call. Sorry. So,
Yeah, sure.
um, so private sector, really, it's about innovation. I think looking at new ways of addressing risk, looking at new technologies, looking at cost saving measures. I think there is a notion out there that resilient infrastructure is more expensive. It does not have to be. We put out a report last year saying that, when you're looking at issues of floods or hydromet related issues, you could actually replace your hard infrastructure, your concrete infrastructure, with other forms of infrastructure, which are nature-based solutions or softer infrastructure. Private sector, by actually coming to governments and saying, you want us to build infrastructure to address coastal flooding. Well, if you build it in type A, which is hard infrastructure, it's going to cost you X. If you build it with soft infrastructure, such as mangroves, may cost you X minus X%. And that's sort of the innovation and solutioning that is needed, that is right now missing in the market, which I would say the private sector could actually go in and really show governments how it's possible to innovate in this sector, save money, and provide more infrastructure for the same cost, which is going to be needed. So for me, governments is about data, policy setting, codes and standards, financial incentives. MDBs is really sort of piloting innovation, and then the private sector is really about innovating in this space for cost savings, more efficient use of resources. And of course, there's a lot more work to be done in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, Amit, we are having this conversation when the climate change conference is COP-29 is taking place at Baku, Azerbaijan. What's your view about the road ahead, and how do you see this playing out, Amit?
Thanks, Gaurav. I think for CDRI, like you reminded me right in the beginning, we are very new. There are days it doesn't feel very new, but we're actually still very new. About 4.5 years since we have been in existence. This is the first time we will actually have a pavilion at COP. So last year we became an observer to the COP processes. We will be there in Baku with the pavilion, where we've invited, so between partners and the secretariat, we are hosting 36 sessions over the next 2 weeks. The idea is that we are really going to discuss different aspects of disaster relevant infrastructure. It's going to be about the modeling that I talked about in data. It's going to be about health infrastructure resilience. It's going to be about power sector resilience. It's also going to be about, what can the private sector do, incentives that the government can provide. How do we address emerging risks such as heat? So we've really got a very, 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 a busy schedule over the next 2 weeks with 36 sessions. We're also going to make some announcements. So the IRIS program that I talked about, where we're already supporting 13 countries with a total funding of about $5.8 million of grant money. In COP29, we will announce the second cohort of countries that will receive support. That will be in the tune of about $8 million. The expectation is, and we're very close to it. I mean, I have it in the back of my pocket, but I'll save it for next week. We have about 10 to 12 new countries that will receive funding, as well as some of the older countries that will receive funding for newer projects. We're very excited by that because in a way, we'll then be supporting about 25, 26 countries out of around 50 odd small island developing states to really move the needle on resilient infrastructure. We're also going to be sharing that we've got an open call to cities. So we have an urban resilience program where we've launched a call inviting cities to look at the utility providers. So we're saying basically cities need to address growing risks from flooding and extreme heat. In that space, your utility providers, your power supply providers, your water supply providers, etc., need to look at these issues from a more risk reduction point of view. We're inviting cities to apply for grant funding to us to do that. We're also going to be launching, interestingly, a playbook for the financial sector to see how they can actually understand physical climate risk in their portfolios. So these are just 3 announcements, but like I said, it's going to be a very busy period for us with 36 sessions. And we're very excited because it's the first time we'll actually have a pavilion in a COP, and we're looking forward to see how the sessions go.
Absolutely, Amit. Thank you so much for taking the time out and dropping by to have this conversation with us and sharing a deep insight and perspective on a variety of issues on climate resilience, on developing infrastructure that is climate resilient, on the idea of resilient dividends, and also how we end up actually calculating the average annual loss in infrastructure space and what the global community of infrastructure community, the roles of the government, and also what role the multilateral development banks in the private sector can collectively. Thank you so much, Amit.
Thank you so much, Gaurav, for having me, and I'll be happy to come back anytime.